Welcome to Lecture 5 of On Truth, the public lectures organized by the research project PERITIA, Policy, Expertise and Trust in Action. I'm Maria Bagramian, a professor of philosophy at University College Dublin, and I'm the coordinator of PERITIA. The project is funded by the European Commission Horizon 2020 funding scheme and spreads across 11 institutions across 10 countries. The lecture series on truths focuses on the conditions of trust in our current age of disinformation. The lectures are hosted by UCD's Center for Ethics in Public Life and the American University of Armenia. Barvekeke aisorva PERITIA dasahosucha. That was an Armenian translation of the shorter version of the welcome. The lectures are also simultaneously translated into Armenian and will be recorded in Armenian as well as in English versions. Today's speaker, I'm proud to say, is Professor Dan Sperber, who is a member of the advisory board of PERITIA and is one of the best-known cognitive scientists in the current academic scene. And he'll be introduced by my colleague, Dr. Shane Bergin from UCD School of Education, who is also a member of PERITIA Consortium. So welcome, Shane, and welcome, Dan.
Thank you so much, Maria. And it's a pleasure to see so many people tuning in today for our presentation, Trust versus Argument, by Professor Dan Sperber, who is a French social and cognitive scientist. Indeed, he's a philosopher too, based at the Central European University and Institut Jean Nicod. And this is the last lecture in this part of the Untruth lecture series, where we've explored trust in an age of disinformation. But it is not the very last, I suppose. We will be back in the autumn with more lectures for you to tune into, and we hope that you will join them and that you will register for them in due course. We also have 3 other talks that I'll speak about in a moment that may be of interest to you. So back to our speaker today, Professor Sperber. He is the author of numerous articles in anthropology, in linguistics, philosophy, and psychology. And as well as as authoring articles in those areas, he's written several books that may be of interest to you. And they include Rethinking Symbolism, On Anthropological Knowledge, and Explaining Culture. In these books, he has developed a naturalistic approach to culture under the name of Epidemiology of Representations. Another publication that may be of interest, and I suspect will inform some of today's talk, is a book he co-authored with Hugo Mercier. And the book is entitled The Enigma of Reason, A New Theory of Human Understanding. This work was described by the Financial Times as a brilliant piece of philosophical jiu-jitsu. What a way to introduce a book. The Financial Times indeed goes on to say that the authors seem to delight in turning conventional wisdom on its head, but unlike mere controversialists, every inversion is elegant and indeed compelling. The breadth and richness of their argument defies summary, but their dressing down of logic gives a flavor of its power. So I suppose building on that idea of it defying summary, I'd now like to introduce the professor to give us more than a mere summary of his work, but to give us a treatise on some of the ideas he has been working on in recent years, and to talk to us about trust versus argument. At the end of the talk, you can ask questions and we will try to engage with as many of these as possible. You can do so using the questions and answers button at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get through as many of those as possible, but I can tell you from previous experience that questions that are succinct and to the point tend to be bumped to the top of the queue, as I can do that thing of listening and reading at the same time. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dan for his presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Let me try to, so before I can share my screen, yeah, so now I should be able to do so. Here we go. So, no, it won't be a treatise, it will be a very sketchy sketch about the way rely both on trust and argument in providing information to others and gaining information from others. This short presentation is based on work I've done with many others, with D.D. Wilson, with whom I've been working on communication for a long time, the book on reason that you mentioned, work with Olivier Mascaro on development of trust in children, and a paper called Epistemic Vigilance with several other authors who has started many further research by members of the team and others. The general issue is, how do we gain epistemic influence on others? How do we come, more simply, to get others to believe something? And conversely, how do we benefit from the epistemic influence of others? How do we learn from others? And this is a topic which has been much discussed since ancient rhetoric. And a very classical distinction, which has been discussed for centuries, is whether persuasion on the one hand and conviction on the other hand are one and the same things or different things, and how do we relate to one another. So persuasion can be used in a very wide sense. It just means to cause others to accept one's ideas, one's influence, and so on. And then one way to distinguish two main ways in which this persuasion, this wide sense, can be achieved is to distinguish conviction, which appeals to reasons, to arguments in particular, and persuasion now in a more narrow sense, which is said to appeal to emotions. I won't discuss this in a type of classification of which there are so many versions and which have been discussed so intensively, because I think they are largely beside the point. In any case, it's epistemic influence mostly takes place by means which it's not a matter of persuasion in any sense, because most of the things that we learn from others, we accept on trust. Basically, trust in testimony is the main source of our knowledge about the world, both general knowledge and knowledge about particular. People tell us things and we believe them. And it's also the main way in which we can influence others, just by informing them, informing people who trust us to speak competently. But of course, this raises a lot of issues. So learning from others is indeed a major aspect of human life, to a degree totally unmatched in other animal species. Most of what we know, we learn from others. Of course, we learn something individually by own experience and so on, or reflection. But even then, we used to do that as background, as premises, as relevant consideration, a lot of knowledge that we got from others. There is no knowledge that we got purely on our own. And in most cases, when we learn from others, we didn't have to be convinced or persuaded in any way. Again, we accepted what we were told on trust. And arguably, we did so on good grounds. So trust is indeed a major aspect of human interaction, more than any other primate species. Humans trust one another to an incredible degree. We may be very aware all the time of lack of trust, insufficiency of trust, and so on. But again, compared to a social world where trust plays little or no role, as you find in many other animal species, this is the degree of trust of humans is remarkable, and is well illustrated by the very beginning of this wonderful book by Sarah Hardy called Mothers and Others, and the subtitle, which you may not be able to read, is relevant: The Evolutionary Origins of Mutual Understanding. And she starts by imagining what it would be like if, instead of having a plane full of people, you had a plane full of apes, other than humans. So passengers crowded together on an aircraft are just one example of how empathy and intersubjectivity are routinely brought to play in human interaction. But just imagine if, instead of human beings being crammed and annoyed aboard an airplane, it were some other species of apes. And she described what would happen if it were chimpanzees. Any one of us would be lucky to disembark with all 10 fingers and toes still attached. Bloody earlobes and other appendages would litter the aisles. Compressing so many highly impulsive strangers would be a recipe for mayhem. So I know, I've read the news that flight attendants in the United States have been recently repeatedly attacked, but precisely it makes the news because that's not what we expect. we expect to be able to indeed sit next to strangers and not be aggressed by them, and indeed be helpful to one another when the occasion arises. So for such kind of trust in each other to be possible, we have to have some degree of vigilance. So when you enter on a plane, it's just that not that you just trust that everything will be okay. You are careful not to hurt other people or do something unpleasant to them, and you keep, a watch on what others are doing, and you're able, of course, to react if something goes awry. So humans are spontaneously, I would argue, both trustful and vigilant. Vigilant about the behavior of others, and vigilant about their own behavior and about how it may be seen by others. And in fact, without this vigilance, trust wouldn't be really possible. And vigilance is not distrust. Vigilance, as I mean, is a low-key monitoring of risk involved in interaction with others. Again, you walk down the street and you do that for your pleasure. You're not afraid. There are strangers, people you've never met, who are walking very close to you. They're in a position, if just they push their hand, they could hit you. They could bump into you. But so it doesn't, the risk doesn't obsess you. You do go out and have fun, but you do keep an eye on who is walking where, so as to both avoiding yourself to hurt them, and if they are distracted, avoiding or aggressive, avoiding being hit by them. So the point is, and that's not about epistemic trust, it's about trust in general. We can be trustful because we are vigilant. So it's not either trust or vigilance, it's both. But here we're concerned about epistemic trust that we may have in what we are told, trust in information that is provided to us, our capacity to accept as true or probable what we are told. So first, a simple observation: humans are remarkably trustful and disposed to believe what they are told. I mean, that's, again, it's obvious. I don't think it's a bone of contention. But then the question arises, so and it's been much discussed in philosophy, do humans automatically believe what they are told? Did God, as Thomas Reid, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, argued, put in us this disposition to trust, or did evolution do so, as Ruth Millikan would argue? Do we automatically believe what we are told, unless, of course, there's some salient reason to be distrustful? And that's a thesis been argued by others, famously by Locke, to go back in philosophy. Do we trust, or at least should we trust, only when we have reasons to trust? Is trust something spontaneous, part of our nature, to speak, or is it something that we do because we have good reason to do it, and we do it reflectively? And I don't want to go into this discussion because I think neither of these answers is correct. There are reasons both why we should be trusting and, as I said, vigilant, which is not distrusting, which needn't be based on reasoning all the time. Should I trust, shouldn't I? I will say more about that. But first, an evolutionary argument against automatic trust, which has to do with the benefits and risks of communication. In the human case, both the benefits and risk of communication are huge. Humans depend on communication with others, first to become a competent adult, to learn about it. You can't become an adult without a huge amount of communication from others. But then also for daily interactions, for joint action, which is a very large part of what we do all the time, to know what to expect in our environment and so on. So we depend on communication massively. And indeed, we have basically to accept much of the information that's provided to us. But that makes us, of course, highly vulnerable to misinformation. Misinformation which may be due to our sources being mistaken, not being competent, giving information that happens to be false. But I don't think that this is the worst problem, because we can also be wrong on our own, and information for others needn't be more in risk of being mistaken than our own information. But other people have different interests, and it may be in their interest often enough to mislead us, not necessarily to lie to us downright, not to deceive us in any profound way, but to present things in a light which is not really accurate, which is not authentic, and which it is in their interest that we should accept, but it's not in our interest to be so misled. So communication is advantageous to honest communicator, to people who tell the truth to the best of their competence. But it would be, even more advantageous if you're willing to say things not as you believe they are, but as you would like other people to believe they are, provided others trust you. And to some degree, we do that all the time, just in our presentation of self. We present ourselves under a better light than is the case. We don't share relevant bits of information that would be detrimental to our reputation, and we tend to improve on what we know is the case. So given this difference of interest between the communicator and the audience, not all the time, but quite often, automatic trust would render communication unstable. For communication to evolve in biological terms, the capacity to communicate, but also to evolve in a group, in a community, to evolve in a relationship between two people, it's got to be advantageous both for communicator and addressee, and the roles are typically switched, and that means that the risk of deception must be limited to a very large degree, and automatic trust would make us totally vulnerable to such risk. So for communication to evolve, communicated information must be adequately filtered. So that's the argument why automatic trust is not a likely picture of what happens. And the way it's filtered, we argued, is a suite of mechanism of what we call epistemic vigilance. Epistemic vigilance is not, again, distrust. It's a low-key monitoring of the risks involved in communication. It's not something you're obsessed about. It's not a paranoid disposition. It's just as you walk down the street and you are having fun, but you are in a low-key way monitoring the behavior of others so as not to bump into them. In communication, you have such similar low-key monitoring of what others are doing. So we can be trustful because we are vigilant. So there is not either trust or vigilance, it's trust and vigilance together. And epistemic vigilance, we've argued, is not one mechanism. It is a suite of mechanisms of various scope, some really specialized for epistemic vigilance, others having to do with vigilance in a wider range, almost, and others specialized for certain type of communication. So some of these mechanisms maybe evolved psychological mechanisms shared in the species, other are cultural specific, other are institutional, as you find in scholarly institutions, and so on. So epistemic vigilance is a series of mechanisms, but they can be classified in as much, because they have two main targets. You have to be vigilant toward the source. Somebody is trying to share information with you. Should you believe them? So the general question is whom to believe. That's vigilance towards the source. But there's also vigilance towards the content. Not all contents are equally believable. And the other question that these mechanisms try to answer is what to believe. So let's look a bit at vigilance towards the source. Whom to trust, about what, and in what circumstances. It's not a question of sorting people. Oh, I trust this person and not that. Each person we trust on whom we trust on some issues, but not on every. We trust more or less. We trust in certain circumstances, but not in others, because again, you might trust your travel agent about where to go on a holiday, but not necessarily about what medicine to take if you have some kind of medical condition, and so on. You can think of examples very, very, very easily. So it's not the source, just listing people, but understanding about which person, where, in what conditions, about what things can be best trusted, when might it be better to withhold trust and belief. And evidence of trustworthiness, individual of source trustworthiness, comes in many ways. There's general evidence provided by the past interaction you had with others, their reputation, what you hear from third parties about them, what you know about their domain of competence. All this provides you with evidence to decide how much to trust. And there are a lot of circumstantial evidence, knowledge of what happens in the case and the involvement of your interlocutor in the case. Do their and your interest align, or are they different and so on. So all this comes into light. And we do that again very spontaneously, to a large degree intuitively. We don't have to reflect to allocate our trust in a roughly appropriate way. And vigilance towards the content, as I said, some beliefs are more, some contents are more believable than others. First is somebody says something which is self-contradictory, which is inconsistent, incoherent, that's just not believable. And and it might come from the most trustable person, we wouldn't believe it. But also more generally important, because internal incoherence is not that frequent, but coherence with what you already take to be the case. So you're told something which kind of fits what you know, or even may contribute in making what you know even more coherent. For instance, explain something that you knew to be the case, and now you have an explanation. That's certainly a reason a favorable condition to accept the information that you're provided. But you might say, in order to be vigilant towards the content this way, to check both for internal coherence and coherence with what you already take to be the case, seems to be a heavy load. I mean, if every time you told something you had to check for this kind of coherence, you would be busy all the time doing that and not taking advantage of information you've been provided. Well, that's a mistake, I would argue, because attending to coherence is not in a light way. I mean, we don't explore all our knowledge to say, oh, maybe there could be an incoherence somewhere. We look at the coherence of what we're told to other information in the context in which what we're told is relevant. It's relevant to what we are planning to do, what we know about some person, and so on. And so that's something we do in any case, because understanding and using communicated information involves integrating it with past information, with what we already take to be the case. Again, not the whole of it, but that with which the new information interacts in a relevant manner. So it's in this process that we may hit on the fact that, oh, there's some incoherence there. It's not that you automatically reject something that's incoherent with what you already take to be the case. For after all, it might be very relevant to correct some mistake you've made. But then you have a problem because, you know, either you have a choice either to reject the information when you had good reason to trust the source, and so you have to revise what you believed of the source, or you have to revise other beliefs with which the new information doesn't cohere. In any case, you have to make some epistemic house cleaning, and it can go one way or the other. So, but what happens often is that trust in the source is not enough to accept a piece of information. Often we find ourselves in the following situation. The communicator has a content she's intent on sharing with the addressee. Okay, she wants to say something, and she's keen on having you believe it. But the addressee, you will actually benefit from this content, but if it's true, but you're not in a position to accept it just on trust from the source. So basically, this is what is happening right now. I hope you have a trustful attitude towards me. You trusted me enough to decide to spend some time listening to me and so on. But you're not going to accept the claims I'm making on trust, and you shouldn't. If the theory I'm putting forward is right, it would be beneficial for you to accept it. And it would be beneficial for me to have you accept it because, you know, it's clearly if I defend ideas, I want them to be widely shared. But trust is not going to be enough for you to accept what I say. And that's a common situation in lots of situations, and a kind of bottleneck in communication. It would be advantageous for information to flow from A to B, but condition of trust, simple, honest, normal condition of trust are not sufficient for that. And what happens when trust in the source is not enough is that argumentation directly addresses epistemic vigilance towards the content. What I'm trying to do in this lecture, what you try to do when you try to convince other people, either of general ideas or to go to this restaurant tonight or whatever, you address the epistemic vigilance of your audience, their vigilance towards the content. You try to show them, since clearly their trust in you is not enough, you will try to show that accepting the information you want to convey to them is in fact coherent movement. So argumentation, again, directly addresses epistemic vigilance towards the content. An argument is a consideration that shows the audience that it would be more coherent for them to accept the conclusion than to reject it. And you might think, oh, you know, about intellectual discussions, scholarly debates, political. No, this happens in everyday, in small matters. We give argument, we use argument all the time with the people with whom we're most intimate, whom we trust and trusted, because sometimes our opinion, our understanding of situation diverges. So let's, you know, here's just an invented example. So Diego says to Laila, Claude and Dominique seem so much in love. I imagine they will soon invite us to their wedding. And Layla says, I don't think so. Diego said, I'm willing to bet. And Layla answered, well, they were married 2 months ago. So what Layla is doing is provide an argument that makes it more coherent for Diego to revise his expectation that Claude and Dominique would soon invite them to a wedding, or, you know, because the two things are not consistent. In doing that, Diego uses both, you know, background knowledge that he had before, and also knowledge on which he trusts Layla. When Layla says they were married 2 months ago, he accepts that on her authority. She wouldn't say that if she didn't know that. So he trusts her on that. He didn't trust her on whether or not they would invite her to a wedding before he knew that. So he had one opinion, she had a different one, or so he thought. In order to accept that the fact that Claude and Dominique were married 2 months ago is a compelling argument to assume that they're not going to invite them to their wedding, he also has the background knowledge that people don't get married again 2 months after a wedding. It's not that it's impossible. It's not that it's a logical contradiction, but if you understand how these institutions work, that's not what normally happens for varieties of reasons. So that's just a kind of everyday exchange of argument. Again, the tendency when we discuss argumentation is to think of long series of arguments, proofs, complex theories. No, arguments come in the everyday verbal exchange we have all the time. So if you think of that, argumentation is not an alternative to trust-based communication. It's a way to extend it. Leila and Diego are basically trusting each other. He trusts her when she says that Claude and Dominique were married 2 months ago. So it's not that suddenly they move from a relationship of trust to a relationship of distrust or lack of trust. Is that trust has reached a limit in the ability to converge on an idea. And argumentation now acts as a way to extend this trust among them. And here, an argumentation is a consideration that shows the audience that it would be more, I said, more coherent for them to accept the conclusion, given what they already believe and accept from trust. So, well, that was, sorry, I can go on. The point is this. A mistake that is possible is to think that, oh, it's either argumentation or trust. In the way the title I gave, trust versus argumentation, might invite this understanding. I want to correct that. And indeed, I'll give a simple example that trust is important, for instance, for accepting premises in an argument on trust. But a much more developed case has been made of a very recent, very interesting paper by Katarina Dutil-Novaes called The Role of Trust in Argumentation. I just quote, given that the receiver of an argument purportedly engages first and foremost with its content, one might expect trust to play a negligible epistemic role as opposed to its crucial role in testimony. I argue, on the contrary, that trust plays a fundamental role in argumentative engagement. And she goes on to explain that I illustrate my argument with 2 real-life examples: vaccination hesitancy and the undermining of the credibility of traditional sources of information by authoritarian politicians. I recommend this article. The only point on where I disagree with her is that she believes that we disagree. So most of the time, argumentation is used in a cooperative manner. That was the case between Diego and Leila. This is the case when you make a common decision with friends and you exchange argument, again, which restaurant you go to and so on. cooperative use of argumentation are quite common, and they generally result in convergence of opinion or common decision. As I said, it's common in daily life. We need argumentation to coordinate our goals, our beliefs, and so on. It's not just one, except in very authoritarian relationship where one person decides without ever listening to the others, and that's not a very good way to achieve cooperation. But for instance, there's also a lot of experimental evidence. So many reasoning tasks, like the famous Wesen selection task and others, that people, when they are asked to solve them, fail to resolve, even though tasks are not that difficult. Then you put them in group of 2 or 3 and say, discuss among yourself and try to find a solution. And then the group do much better than the individual. You even have group where none of the members had individually found the solution, but together by exchanging argument, they end up converging on the right solutions. That's resolving a problem jointly is a very common happening among human beings, one which again has been we all experience in our daily life, has been experimentally demonstrated, and now is also, and I could give lots of examples in science in particular, but one interesting example is in politics, where the very idea of deliberative democracy is indeed the idea that exchange of arguments by people having a common goal of resolving a problem, like the groups of citizens which were gathered recently in France to discuss what to do about global warming, are potentially quite successful. It's a cooperative use of argumentation. This has been actually discussed in details by Hélène Landemort in her book of Open Democracy, which I also recommend. But of course, not all use of argumentation are cooperative in this way. Many are of a polemical character, and maybe when you hear the word argumentation, that's what you think of to begin with. You may think of political debates on television where people largely speak across each other without understanding, without convincing one another, and with a huge amount of hostility. And that happens, of course, also in interpersonal relationship. Typically, arguments in a couple at a bad moment. Arguments are not used to converge, but typically to win, to sometimes to humiliate the others and so on, to score a point generally. So you find that quite often. What's happening there? So one thing that maybe is maybe a use of argument to establish a dominance over the addressee against all too often typical in couple relationship and more typically male behaviors towards women, but not only. And also what you get in, say, the political debates that you may watch, but also all kinds of debates, is the goal of the people exchanging argument is not so much to influence one another. They know they won't convince the other party. But the real addressee, also to speak, what might be spectators, third-party audience. And the goal then is to convince the hesitant and to mobilize, to energize those already convinced. And in fact, a lot of such use of argument results not in convergence, but in polarization. So people start with a disagreement, and at the end of that, they disagree even more than they did before, and their audience is more polarized than they were before. Again, there's a lot of studies and experimental evidence to that effect. The kind of case I'm particularly interested in is, and that may be relevant in the context of the work of this PERITIA group, has to do with argumentation, where the arguments are largely opaque to the intended audience. So argumentation fulfills its proper function by allowing the audience to accept or reject a conclusion on the basis of reason that they are able to comprehend and evaluate. That's the whole point. You don't trust me as a source? Now I will give you an argument that you can evaluate on your own independently of the fact that it comes from me. It would be the same argument against somebody else had produced it. Either it's a good argument and you should accept it, or it's not, and never mind the source. And we certainly do that for logical arguments. I mean, you may think that some person is a very nasty, unpleasant person you wouldn't trust on anything personal. But if that person gives you a convincing proof of logical or mathematical things, that's it. I mean, you never mind the source. Of course, for real life issues where it's not a matter of proving or demonstrating some conclusion, you may still be sensitive to arguments of, if you really pay attention to arguments that you can inspect, that you can evaluate, and realize, we all do that sometimes, arguments from people we disagree with, in fact, are not bad. They have a point, so to speak, and we may acknowledge that at least in our own soul, maybe not always publicly. Again, the whole point of argumentation is to allow the audience to evaluate the argument and therefore to take a stance towards the conclusion, hopefully accepted, independently of insufficient trust in the source. So this function, this proper function of argumentation, allowing the audience to evaluate an argument and therefore the conclusion of the argument, it's typically fulfilled among peers, I mean epistemic peers, people who have the same kind of background knowledge, type of competence, and also are socially peers, so they don't have to score a point or win or impose their dominance and so on. Argumentation, however, is often also used in communication between experts and lay audience, to whom technical argument may remain opaque. So a lot of arguments we hear as citizens, also as students, and so, but let's stick to the situation of experts talking to lay people. A lot of these arguments pass above our head. We can't really assess them. We're not in a position to evaluate them. A common trick among social scientists. So in many of the social and human sciences, there's little, in my opinion, too little competence with the use of mathematical, statistical, formal tools, which have become more and more important in this science for good reason. But that gives the opportunity to those who master this tool, are really good at producing formal arguments and models and so on, to impress the audience by presenting at great speed and very densely argument that they know their audience is not going to follow. And on the whole, it works fairly well. I mean, social scientists who are not really competent in the use of formal models tend to be easily over-impressed by these displays of expertise. They should get the expertise themselves and use it, and also become more able to filter the arguments that are given. But again, the situation is a common one. So what is, what does it imply? What is to be done about it? Such opaque arguments. So in fact, and I was just giving the example of this type of interaction between more formal and less formal practitioners of the social science, such opaque arguments may persuade the audience all the same, because their technicality is interpreted as evidence of the source's competence. Somebody who's able to produce such an argument, well, she must really be competent. I can't judge, she must be right. Okay. So argument in that case has an effect. It may persuade people, but not because of its proper function. Not because it is open to an evaluation by the audience. On the contrary, because of its very opacity, or to use the persuasion conviction contrast, it may persuade precisely because it's not in a position to, it's not open to convincing. So a rational attitude, one might argue, would be to suspend judgment on an argument one doesn't understand. But things are not that simple. The fact that an argument is provided can influence one to trust the expert source in at least two ways. So, in particular, the very fact that an expert makes the effort of providing an argument seems to indicate that she expects the audience to be able to appreciate the argument. It's a form of respect. I mean, taking the pain to, instead of just saying, I'm the expert, here's the conclusion. If you go through the production of an argument, it can be taken, and often is, a way to treat your audience with respect. You explain why you arrive to that conclusion. Of course, if you're fully aware that they won't be able to follow the argument, the authenticity of the respect is less obvious, but often it is a genuine form of respect, which weigh in favor of trusting the source. I mean, somebody who treats with respect shows some, at least, degree of alignment of values, of interest, and that makes them more credible. And also an opaque argument may, because of its very opacity, be seen as evidence of the source competence. That person can master such a complex argument, an argument that I'm not able to follow. They really are experts, and their expertise is itself a reason to believe what they say. So to persuade, these opaque arguments, what a point that's important to persuade in this way, these opaque arguments must be seen as intended, not merely to persuade, but the trick must not be apparent if it's a trick, but they must be seen as really intended to convince by being understood and appealing to reason. So the audience will be favorably impressed by such argument, must think, oh, you know, she expects me to understand it. Well, it's my fault if I don't. I should be able to follow the argument, rather than think, oh, she knows very well that I'm not able to follow the argument. So she's pretending to share an argument with me that she knows I can't evaluate. She's pretending to respect me when in fact she doesn't. But it's not clear in which situation you are. You might be in the one, you might be in another, and you might be in so many, you know, chiaroscuro type of situation where it's somewhere in between these two cases. So to conclude and leave time for the question and discussion. So I started by this contrast between persuasion and conviction that many versions of which are found in the philosophy of rhetoric literature. The distinction, I believe, started in that form. Of course, it has origin in classical antiquity, but started being discussed in the 18th century and has been discussed systematically ever since. As I said, it's not this framework derived from classical rhetoric seems to me obsolete in many ways. It's in particular because it's not attentive to genuine cognitive mechanisms involved. But the issue that was addressed by classical rhetoric, by this discussion of conviction and persuasion is of course a very important issue. You know, who should we trust and believe as an audience? How can we be trusted and believed as communicators? And we, again, both sometimes playing one role and sometimes playing the other. And here's one way not to answer the question, but to maybe to reframe it in a useful way. So I don't know about emotions, but when we communicate, we may, and we generally do, just appeals to our audience unreflective intuition. I would argue that in general, cognition is very much intuitive, and we tend to greatly overestimate the role of reasoning, reflection in how we come to form our beliefs. I would moreover argue, and I've argued with Hugo Mercier in the book of Reason, that actually even reflection and reasoning is a form of higher order intuition. It's not, it doesn't contrast with intuition, it's a sub form of intuition of some complexity. So anyhow, appeal to an reflective intuition is involved, both in being trusted and being believed. So to be trusted, basically, you have to give intuitively acceptable evidence of your trustworthiness. And typically, with people you interact with regularly, you've given it over time. So it's not that you give it every time you speak, but also in the way you speak, the way you address, the way you present the thing contributes to making you more or less credible. The evidence you've given to other people comes back to your audience through your reputation. That also contributes to that. Again, this is done, the kind of trust that people have, again, which involves a dimension of vigilance, is one which is intuitively granted, and much of vigilance is intuitive. It doesn't involve, you know, reflecting, in a paranoid manner. Could this be a way to try to deceive me or what? No, it's, we rely very much on intuitions. And much of what we say is also accepted on intuitive grounds. So for that, all you have to do is give information that the audience can accept and trust. So when Leila says that to Diego that Claude and Dominique were married 2 months ago, it doesn't try to reflect how does she know that, should I trust? It takes for granted that he can accept that information for her own trust. That's the intuition he has about what she would say or not say, the kind of information she has access to, and so on. And again, most of our communication is filtered, accepted or rejected on the basis of unreflective intuitions. But, and this is where argumentation comes in, but not only argumentation, we can also appeal to reason, that is to intuitions about argument, that intuitions about considerations that weigh in favor, that support a conclusion or go against it. And we do that, and that's the last square here, in what has been the main topic of this talk, namely argumentation. When in providing arguments that the audience can evaluate, that is by appealing to their reason, we can cause the audience to believe things that they wouldn't believe on trust. But we also can appeal to reason to elicit trust, that is by giving reflective and valuable evidence of our trustworthiness. So if your neighbor in a train gives you and while you're coughing or whatever, gives you some kind of medical advice, you might not trust it spontaneously, but if she tells you that she's a medical doctor, which you will accept on trust, then suddenly she becomes to be trusted on that matter, and gives you reason to believe what she says. So a lot of ways to achieve, to convince others, to influence them, is first to make them trust you. And if they don't do that intuitively, you can give, in fact, what are, in a way, arguments, so that they will think of you as trustworthy. All these form methods interacting in complex ways are much more complex than I can give here. And moreover, and that's the point with which I want to conclude this conclusion, all these form methods can be misused. They can be used in deceptive fashion. You can use people's intuition to make them to appear trustworthy. That's what swindlers develop skills at doing. You may provide information which seems intuitively believable when you know it's not, or you may present information that's hard to believe in a light, framing it in a manner so that it becomes intuitively very plausible, or on the opposite, you can reframe it and cause people to reject it and so on. So a lot of manipulation can go there. So on the reflective side, the evidence you give of your trustworthiness may be honest or dishonest evidence. So information and evidence can be faked in radical ways or in subtle ways. Or argumentation can be misused, and we saw that. It can be misused, for instance, by trying to establish dominance or to browbeat or impress or seduce or intimidate people by providing, by the means of arguments that they are not really in a position to evaluate. But providing arguments that the audience can evaluate, that is providing genuine arguments, is something that can be misused, but it's very hard to fake. Indeed, the whole point is, if it's a genuine argument, it's something that you're genuinely addressed to your audience as an argument, then it's something they can genuinely evaluate. I'm not saying it's totally impossible to trick people even in such cases, but it's hard to fake. So that gives a special place to argumentation in both who we trust and what we believe, and in how we make ourselves trusted and believed. And this was the main point of today's talk. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Sperber, for an incredibly interesting talk. Fascinating words from you today. I have a question for you that actually, we have a number of questions for you, if that's okay. But I'd like to begin by asking you about your final slide and this differentiation between belief and trust. The national science funding body in Ireland, Science Foundation Ireland, has the byline "Believe in Science," and a number of the scientists in Ireland feel quite uncomfortable about that byline. Many would posit that trust in science is a more appropriate byline. I wonder, have you a comment on that?
I would agree with those who prefer trust in science and believe in science. Again, belief is first. Believe in is something that you say believe in God and so on. I understand better the notion of believing statements, believing theories and so on. Believing an institution or believing is less, it's not that it's meaningless, but it's less clear, and I would be more reluctant to automatically give my belief. And on the other hand, trust in science, which again should be a vigilant trust. But that goes without saying, because scientists themselves are all the time vigilant towards their own theories, especially those of other scientists, but it's a kind of cognitive division of labor that they achieve thereby. So the kind of trust you should have in science is not blind trust. It should be a very vigilant trust. And in fact, your very vigilance can be educated by the resources that science itself provides.
Sounds good. I'm thinking of a way to say, you know, careful, vigilant, trust in science in an attractive way that they can fit in a tweet. But no doubt they'll do it. Thank you so much. I have a comment and a question from your colleague Katerina Noves, and she says hello to you and thanks you for your talk, and says that you said in the end there is no disagreement between your views and hers. However, she says, I do think there is still a disagreement on the mechanics of the model. You seem to suggest that evaluating the plausibility of the source and evaluating the plausibility of the content happens more or less in parallel, whereas she thinks it's mostly serial, first source, then content, and asks, do we have a disagreement or not?
Oh yes, that's if she thinks it's serial, then we disagree, yes. I'm glad she found a genuine disagreement between us. She's been doing a lot of very interesting work on argumentation from a different perspective. She's a logician initially with an interest in psychology. And there are points of convergence between her work and the work of my team and myself, and also points of divergence. But again, I recommend her work, and I'm glad to see that we have a disagreement, but a fairly minor one.
And they always make for the best conversations over an academic dinner or at a conference. Our next question is from Michael Surendonk, who asks, why use the term vigilance, which has a sense of non-trusting carefulness to it, instead of using a term such as perception? For example, so is vigilance really necessary for trust, or can we use a more trust-neutral term like perception?
So of course, every kind of lexical decision is difficult. I don't think perception. You don't want a neutral term, because it's being attentive to a risk that what is involved. Not because you live in fear or whatever, but there's a risk. So you're careful. So perception is not particularly geared to risk. It's geared as much to opportunities. So we thought a lot. We first used the word in work with the psychologist Olivier Mascaro, whom I mentioned, working on children's development of trust. And it's quite striking to see how at one point, suddenly they're extremely trusting until about the age of 4. And at one point, suddenly they both discover that they can deceive, that they can lie. It's a world of opportunities. But of course that others can do that too. And now from then on, they become vigilant. Still nice, wonderful, trusting children will become nice, wonderful, trusting adults, but vigilant.
I suppose maybe it's the interpretation of the term itself. And, you know, one might think of vigilance as watching continuously and in, you know, some Stasi-like manner, but I guess one can do it in a more moderate way, as you suggested. Our next question is from Joe McDonough, who asks, how does the media moderate how we evaluate source trustworthiness?
That's I'm not sure. It's a good question. I'm sure that people have done a lot of work on that, and I don't have any. And of course, they care about that. They're worried about it. Discuss it. They're very careful not to compromise their reputation as reliable sources. So you see what happens when what recently happened, for instance, in Britain with the BBC, where it turned out that one journalist had obtained an interview with Lady Di in a dishonest manner. So they really have to project an image of trustworthiness, otherwise. But at the same time, we know that we often do get misinformed from the media, and some care less and over more. But even those who care are not. They have their biases, at least, even their intentions are good. So I'm not really competent. I recognize the problem. It's a good question. I wish I had a better answer.
Maybe Maria might comment on it at the end. My sense is perhaps Honor O'Neill's work on the role of intermediaries might be interesting on how you can build trust with sources such as the media. Our question from Joseph Lenham, who says, can you say a few words on Marcelo Dasca's theory of controversies and ethics of communications? It seems it connects well to your subject today.
So, I like both the man and his ideas. So we were working to a large extent in similar areas, pragmatics. And I'm not going to discuss, first, I don't have them very vivid in my mind. I would probably misrepresent his exact point. I just want to suggest that the general field of pragmatics, to which he made such important contribution, to which myself working with Didier Wilson, we've also tried to contribute, is really fairly crucial to discussing these issues. So a lot of work on pragmatics tends to focalize on, and which is indeed the central topic, on how do we understand what people say, given that the interpretation changes from one context to another. So it's not enough to decode the word and to know the linguistic meaning, to know what people mean. So that's the general question. But the question of how you move from understanding what people mean to believing them or not believing them, it's an issue which actually I hesitate to talk about today and didn't for reason of time. And it's central, and Marcelo Dascal did contribute to that in manners that it would be interesting to discuss in detail, but not here.
Your colleague has the next question, Pierre Jacob, who says at the very end, you propose to reject the distinction between reflection and intuition by introducing a hierarchy of levels of intuitions. For instance, you propose we have higher order intuitions about reasons and justifications for our lower order intuitive judgments. His question is, how far up the hierarchy of higher order intuitions are you willing to go?
So it's not, I don't reject the contrast between reason and intuition, but the contrast is what between a general kind and a subkind. So, we can make a contrast between cats and mammals. Cats has a certain kind of mammals. So reasons are a certain object of intuitions, and reasoning is deploying intuitions about reason in the view that you go have defended. So how far, so indeed then you get to kind of meta level, higher order intuitions about intuition. So can you have intuitions about intuition about intuition? Yeah, sure. How far up can you go? I don't think that there is any kind of limit that's inbuilt either in human mind or in science or anywhere. Most of the time, I think we don't go very far, but when it's relevant, I think that humans are virtuosos in the capacity to deploy higher order representation or meta representations, as we call them. And that's true also in reasoning. What happens, however, is that scholars, logicians in particular, but generally scientists and so philosophers, assume that we spend most of our time at this high level of very reflexive and even higher order reflection, and that which is part of what they do professionally. It's not what we do, including they, when they live an ordinary life, most of the time. It's a resource that's available, but most of the time the cost is not matched by a benefit.
Our next question is from Yannick Cole, who asks, how does the intentional use of fallacies to convince someone relate to your view?
So the study of fallacy, which is another thing which goes back to classical antiquity and the teaching of rhetoric, is, we believe, I say we because also Hugo has also written on that, quite mistaken. I mean, most of his fallacies are fallacious in one context, absolutely good arguments in another. So it's a wonderful object. I know some people have lists of fallacies in the toilet, so that when you're wasting time there, you can look at them and smile. It's not good science, it's not good psychology, it's not good logic. It's a fallacious program that should be enjoyed as an historical curiosity. And I hope that my own work relates to that only in that I've tried to explain the fallacy of fallacies.
Thank you. Marie Guillot has our next question, and thanks you for the wonderful talk, and refers to your final claim that argumentation is hard to fake, and wonders, could conspiracy theories count as fake argumentation?
No, what typically you find in conspiracy theories is what is totally fake are the premises. We have no problem not only cherry picking the facts that they want to use as premises, but also add pseudo facts to them. And starting from that, we typically reason in a fairly decent manner. If the premise were true, the conclusion would often follow. We're not worse at, or to put it like this, conspiracy theories are not worse at reasoning, at moving from premise to conclusions than most people. They're not great, they're not better. In fact, they exploit this possibility. What they lack is honesty in evaluating the premises, or even producing premises, and in the total commitment to reaching a conclusion by whichever way, rather than finding out what is the case. But they don't reach it precisely. We are talking about the classical fallacies. They don't reach it by having fallacious reasoning. They just reach it by having shitty premises.
Absolutely, I think Kassam would agree with that view. We had him
yes,
for our second speaker.
I enjoyed this talk. Yes.
Yes, very much. Our question next is from Ale V, who asked, "Do you differentiate between trust and confidence?"
Not really. I mean, I don't. I use trust quite systematically as a technical term. Sometimes I've used confidence as a synonym. I can imagine that for a certain purpose it would be useful to distinguish them, but in my own work I haven't thought much about it.
Our final question is one that I think is fantastic as a physicist. I wonder what you'll make of it. It comes from Linda Salman, and Linda asks, how can we have a vigilant trust in science when it is so difficult for most of us to judge the validity of a specific scientific assertion?
So, and that's true even for scientists. So I'm a scientist, but I'm just like a layman in most domains of science. If I listen to physicists, so for instance, I'm as much a layman as would be the next person in the street. So the vigilance I would advise that we can have as laymen regarding science in which we have no competence is to, if there is a general consensus in the field, then it makes sense to assume, it's not 100% sure, but to assume they're right. So take global warming, there's consensus on that, the efficiency of vaccines. So you can always find a little minority of dissent, but basically, so in this kind of field, so the vigilance has just to consist in seeing if you're dealing with generally established, well-entrenched theories or views that are not being seriously questioned, and then it's sensible to accept, again, with an open mind, but accept them. To give, there's one example, when people kind of have doubt. So, when Harvey discovered the function of the heart, namely to pump blood, that was a fantastic discovery. It was extraordinary. It was a new idea. People had so many other ideas about the function of the heart, if any, and so on and so on. So by now, do you know somebody who's, I don't believe science. No, the heart does something else. In issues where there are controversies, like fundamental physics and so on, first, if you like me, you don't fully understand it, you're aware of there are controversies, follow it if it gives you some kind of intellectual stimulation. Don't fail, imagine be first vigilant toward yourself and acknowledge your own limits. And precisely because physicists are not in agreement among themselves, get what you can from it, but don't take sides, don't jump to conclusions. Be vigilant towards, but it's vigilance based largely on your own ignorance and on the fact that the scientists themselves are vigilant towards one another in a fairly dramatic manner.
You mentioned, though, that I find it interesting that you would say when it comes to a scientific discipline that's beyond your expertise, that you feel you're equivalent to a layperson. I'm not so sure, because you are familiar with the, I suppose, the scientific process where the layman may not be. And I suppose...
But first, scientific process really varies a lot from one science to another. I mean, many of my friends, they are primatologists who go and study apes and other primates in South America. So, that practice as compared to somebody who works in molecular biology or somebody who works in fundamental physics is such a different practice. So yes, what they have is indeed this very strong epistemic vigilance, which has been, as I said, it's not just a kind of evolved disposition, something that's been reinforced by lots of culturally developed competencies, techniques, methods, and mathematical tools, and so on. But a lot of people are not scientists at all, are able to follow that. They understand that. Much of this way of thinking is present in societies and for people who work in technical skills, in economic problems. And so no, I don't think that scientists are that separate from the rest of the society or the rest of society from them. So some people, of course, have no interest in science, have just a kind of cliche view and a great distance. But there's a wide, well-read public who reads books about science, which are often quite successful, and understand them in a very intelligent manner, and sometimes even contributes to the work itself.
Absolutely. Something that struck me when listening to one of, I think, a Guardian podcast that interviewed you recently was the point that was made, that was that when scientists are speaking as experts, but beyond their expertise, or they're being positioned as experts beyond their area of expertise, that they can often fall into or move away from reason when I suppose presenting an argument. And this has come up a lot in our lecture series this term, and indeed Heather Douglas spoke about it in her last presentation. If a scientist is asked to go and to speak perhaps with the media about something, but it's not exactly in their area of expertise, how far away from their expertise do you think it's reasonable for them to move and still position themselves as a scientist or an expert?
What's important, the second part of your question. I mean, if they elicit trust because they are scientists, and they use that authority that's granted to them and that they work on having candidates to them by the public to talk about topics on which they're not particularly competent. That's not, I don't find that, I mean, they're citizens, they're allowed to talk about anything, to have an opinion about anything, that's fine. But they're authoritative in the domains of competence. Otherwise, they can exchange argument, they should be listened to, like we should all listen to one another. But I don't think they should be granted a kind of superior voice.
I think that's a very valid point and a great point to draw our conversation to a close, Professor Sperber. Thank you so much for your presentation today and for engaging with the many questions that came through. Apologies to those of you who posed questions that we didn't answer, but they really were wonderful. And I can say that the remarks coming through on the chat have been incredibly positive, and people have enjoyed this presentation very much.